Mike Milken, thank you so much for joining us today. You've written a great book that we're going to share with a lot of the folks here. That tells, in my mind, three fascinating stories, all related. First, your early life, your motivations for becoming a health-focused venture philanthropist, then your own so far so good, successful 30-year battle with a very brutal form of prostate cancer, and what you learned from that. And then last, why you are so optimistic about the future. You're about as optimistic as anyone I've ever met. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So vis-a-vis the book, the first question is why now? You've been a major philanthropist for 5 decades. You've been a leader in funding disease research and innovations for most of that time, but you've never really written a book, with the exception of 2. Actually, I ordered them, very interesting looking cookbooks for people who are going through the difficult disease recovery and treatment. But so why now? What made you decide this is the time?
Well, if we're just going to stay with medical research, I'd say it is the culmination of when you see an opportunity, how do you identify it, one, but two, how do you cause change to occur? And so the purpose of the book was really a call to action, that we're at this inflection point in medical research. And if I go back over time, between 95 and 98, 1995 and 1998, we worked on putting something called the March on, and that we saw a tremendous need to increase the investment in medical research as technology was unfolding. And we worked for 3 years on this effort to put on a march, which occurred in the back half of 1998. But the goal of the march was to double the NIH budget. And so there was a point in time there that thousands of people had worked to try to increase the US government's investment in medical research and had not really been successful. And we concluded that one of the reasons is the effort was so fragmented, and 500 different diseases, all talking to government leaders simultaneously. And so what we did is we asked people if they could just step down on some of their efforts, and we could focus just on cancer. So the need to bring more financial resources to bear on medical research led to this march in 98, and the president signed into law a couple months later the doubling of the NIH. And unadjusted for inflation, there's been a $500 billion increase in basic research and work by the NIH that laid the groundwork for many of our advances. So there was a reason that a march was required, and it required bringing 500,000 people to Washington and around the country to cancer centers. And it benefited research for all forms of life-threatening diseases. It slowed down again about 12, 13 years later, and we had a retreat on how to do innovations in medical research, how to innovate innovations in medical research. The outcome of that work is it pointed towards the need to create a new center at the National Institutes of Health, which became known later, when it was formed, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. And yes, we had a lot of work going on in basic science. You had clinical, but the middle, the translational science that stood between basic and clinical, was slowing things down. And so this effort, we mobilized to try to get this new center created, really focused in this case on a small number of people, particularly Harry Reid, Majority Leader in the Senate, and Eric Cantor, Majority Leader in the House. And President Obama signed into law the increase in the new institute of the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, and a $5 million investment resulted in a $5 to $6 billion commitment. If I jump forward to COVID, once again, there was this challenge that was challenging the world, the United States, and we had to take different steps and different actions that the government took. And so when we see the benefits of what occurred during COVID, we are on the verge of an entire revolution here due to dramatic changes in technology in medical care science, which will ultimately improve not only the length of life, but the quality of life. But the natural tendency is, after you think you've solved a problem, to move on. And the purpose of the book, I concluded, is it was not time to move on. It was, quote, not time to take your foot off the gas pedal, but it was, and put it on the brake. It was time to push down on the gas pedal. And that is why the very, very difficult job of writing a book, and anyone who's never written a book, who has a day job or 10 day jobs, knows how difficult that is to do. And it would have been better if it was a year earlier. So it was 2 years late at the one extreme, but really it should have been a year earlier. But I was like, the analogy I would give you, if you're old enough to remember the I Love Lucy show, she had this show where there were chocolates coming down the line, and every day you want to go work on the book, but the assignments and what's going on delays it. So, but that was the central reason. We are on the verge of a complete revolution in dealing with people's health and medical research, and needed to give this as a wake-up call, a call to action.
I think it's a great wake-up call. Of course, you've just identified Jeff Moore as Ethel, if you're Lucy from the show. So one of the organizations that you stood up and kind of one of the cores has always been Faster Cures, the organization, which is different than the book because there's no gap between Faster and Cures. And at one point you described that you're in Faster Cures sort of iteration 3.0. Would you please walk through what was 1.0, why and when and how did it evolve to 2? And what is, again, when and how did it get to the current format that it's in with the current strategy?
So I had been funding medical research for about 20 years when I was diagnosed in 93 and given 18 months to live. So I tried to look at where we stood on medical research. I had lost 10 relatives to cancer at that time. And in the 1970s, I had spent considerable time working on melanoma. My father was diagnosed with melanoma. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with breast cancer, and many other relatives. And a couple years later, my father had a reoccurrence. I visited most of the major cancer centers in America, and I concluded about 2 years later that science would not move fast enough to save my father's life. He died about 2.5 years after that. So here I am faced with this issue, but I'm not alone. 1 in 8 American men are diagnosed with prostate cancer. 1 in 2 men get cancer, 1 in 3 women. And so I had looked at the playing field, if we want to call it then, and concluded we needed to create a new organization. The event that kind of really drove it home to me is that I was at a research conference at MD Anderson, and I noticed that there was no one from Memorial Sloan Kettering there. And the person putting on the conference told me that they viewed Memorial Sloan Kettering as a competitor. And my comment was, not to a patient, they're not a competitor. And so we formed then something called the 1.0 called CAPCure. CA, all cancers, P, prostate, cure all life-threatening diseases. And we went out at that time to look at how could we change how medical research goes on, how could we change the landscape. And I would say 1.0 was very focused on 3 areas. 1, recruiting the best and brightest to work in the field of medical research. Now, you can wish you have a great company, you wish you have a good sports team, but if you don't have the players on the field or the individuals, it's not going to be that successful. Number two, cooperation. And so we spent in the early months of '93 telling people that they had to cooperate if we were going to fund their research. Many people said they had so many other things to do, but they had a report coming out in 6 months in a year, or Nature or Cell. And after that occurred, they would share it, but the work had to be first made public in a publication. We told them that their work is so important that they wouldn't need our funding, that anyone would fund their work. But within 6 months, everyone agreed to share their data, share their research. So we had cooperation, and Andy Grove, who was on our board of CapCure, was very helpful in helping build out the technology. So in some cases, it was easier for someone at MD Anderson to speak to someone at Memorial than it was to talk to someone at the same institution. So building that network. The third was this focus on funding, more money for medical research. And no matter how large any philanthropic effort is, even the combination of the Gates Foundation plus Buffett is very small compared to what government funding could be. And that's when we decided our approach would be to double the NIH budget. This wasn't a new idea. Many people had tried, and as I mentioned, by focusing on cancer in the early 90s, people thought if you were diagnosed with cancer, you were going to be dying. It's much different today with our advancements. And so visiting with more than half the Senate and a good percentage of the House and the administration, and then putting this march out caused that to occur. And those were our efforts, heavily focused on CA, all forms of cancer, P, prostate, and cure all life-threatening. 2.0 was the creation of the shared network on how to create a medical philanthropy that was driven. And so best practices, and we brought more than 100, almost 200 different disease organizations in 2.0 to build a template of how you could build the most effective disease-specific organization. And then 3.0 was really the separation of CapCure began, where the CA was focused on all cancers, P became the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and Cure became Faster Cures, all life-threatening diseases, including cancer. And so 3.0 has been very focused on other areas such as the patient, getting the patient involved, very focused on clinical trials, very focused on health equity, trying to make sure those in clinical trials reflect the dramatic changes in demographics, not just in the United States, but around the world. If you go back in time, at one point, 75% of everyone not born in the United States was born in Europe, and about 10% in Canada. Today, more than 70% were born in Latin America or Asia, and more than 10% were born in sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, there are more people that weren't born in the United States from sub-Saharan Africa today than from Europe. And so many of our clinical trials did not reflect. And I would say the other area we've been extremely focused on is the area of prevention, which we began in '93, and the ability of access to quality care at all demographic and socio-demographic levels. So that would be 3.0, using data.
Which makes me think 4.0 is going to be an AI version, Faster Cures GPT. You mentioned prevention, and I want to follow up on that because you talk a lot, particularly in the book, on diet and how you radically changed your diet. And obviously, obesity is a contributor to every disease just about, but that's only gotten worse over time. And environmental carcinogens are things that we worry about too. What I wonder, can we win any war on cancer if we don't put as much effort into prevention, if not more, that we put into treatment?
Well, you've made a simple analogy there. And when I was younger, and maybe you were younger, we had this Fram oil filter ad where you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And if you paid me later, the cost was substantially more. And so the work we began in 93, as I focused, why did all my relatives die? Not one was successful in their efforts. None of them changed their diet. None of them changed what we began known as microbiome. In Indian medicine or Ayurveda medicine that's only 5,000 years old, they viewed your gut or your microbiome as your second brain. So everything you're eating, drinking, what you're doing has to be absorbed as energy, waste product, etc. And therefore, beginning in 93, I made the decision not to eat anything except raw fruits and vegetables till I could figure out what to do. And that lasted for a couple years. If you looked at the anecdotal evidence, if we looked at hormone-driven cancers, you would see that in plant-based diets, such as China, Japan, or other places, much lower levels of hormone-driven cancers. In fact, probably less than 10%. And therefore, there was a great deal of evidence. But in 93, 94, you could not prove anything. There was no sequencing going on. Francis Collins began his efforts on sequencing the human genome in 93. And it took more than 10 years, billions of dollars. So you couldn't prove it. So when we wanted to expose this to the traditional medical community, the answer was prove it. You couldn't prove it. And I remember in 94 at one of our scientific retreats that I wrote about, I tried to suggest we put the person that formed the Center for Human Nutrition on the panel during the scientific retreat. And they told us this would denigrate the quality of the retreat. And after extensive negotiations, they allowed Dr. David Heber, PhD, MD, etc., to speak at lunch as long as he wasn't on the formal program. If I took you forward 25 years to a scientific retreat, you would find 15 to 20% of every session was related to microbiome. So you might not be able to change your genes until we fully figure out how to apply CRISPR, but you can change how your genes are expressed by changing your microbiome. And today, we now have approved giving the microbiome of one person who responded well to treatment to another person who did not respond well to see if that will make the difference. So today, the analysis, now your comment here, what are we going to do? We're going in reverse, we're not going forward. But there's a lot more vegetarian restaurants throughout this country and other places in the world than there were before. And Americans love just giving them the morning after pill. So therefore, as we know today, unfortunately, it's targeted at the moment to the higher income levels when the lower needs it more. But we have now stuff for diabetes that also controls weight. But the idea that we've made advances in heart disease, we made advances in many other things that were the leading cause of death because of breakthroughs in science. It's inevitable that societies are going to adopt this. You have countries such as Chile or Mexico that have put in sugar taxes on soft drinks to try to increase the cost to society. And 15 years ago, we put on these things, reports, and did all this research on an unhealthy America. And you saw that 70% or more of all healthcare costs are not heredity, they're lifestyle. Based on what you eat, whether you exercise, what you drink, what you breathe, as you referred to. And so I am quite optimistic today with science that you can show what happens. We now know that what having anti-inflammatory diet can do compared to an inflammatory diet. You started to see that with consumers. The move to Greek yogurt from regular yogurt, where it's less inflammatory. Unfortunately, those manufacturers that were the leaders in manufacturing yogurt didn't adjust, and now the major sellers of yogurt in this country are those that focused on health. So if I went to medical school in China 30 or 40 years ago, I never studied diabetes. But now with 20,000 fast food restaurants in China, particularly Eastern China, you have an epidemic of diabetes, substantial increase in hormone-driven cancers, and the same in West Africa. So the proof is there that wasn't there before. And yes, medical science in terms of a pill might help us adjust to lose weight, which we're seeing here today. But ultimately, I think we'll find a way to encourage people to have a diet. Now, for me, after 2 years of only eating fresh fruit and vegetables like any human being, I longed for all those things that I loved: a Philadelphia cheesesteak, a Caesar salad, chocolate pudding. And so since 95, when you talk about those cookbooks, we've put out, we're going to change the ingredients. It's going to look the same. It's going to taste the same. It's just going to have different ingredients. And so if you don't provide good taste, you're never going to convince people to, quote, eat healthy. But I do think we're on the verge here of a change.
I agree with that. There's so much that you write about, and people like Dr. Peter Attia, you probably read his book Outlive recently, which is wonderful. But I'm only going to go so far, and raw fruit and vegetables only for 2 years, just not going to happen. At some point, it's just not worth it. But let me ask you on coordination, because you may be the most effective and long-term health-focused venture philanthropist. You've accelerated all kind of cures, and as a fellow survivor, thanks for what you've done. But of course, you're not the only one. And it feels like lots of people who have been very successful in tech or finance or energy now have eponymous foundations, and a lot of them are researching treatments and cures in health. What do we do to avoid waste and redundancy and inefficiency of people all having kind of the same back offices when, as you guys have done, it's putting the money in the frontline researchers, in the people who maybe couldn't get the funding because they're too far out there? How do you think about coordinating what has been an awesome increase in generosity, but also a whole lot of money seemingly chasing similar things?
I think you've made an excellent point here. If I look at our own philanthropy over 50 years, a great deal of medical philanthropy is not productive. I'd say education also. And so if you take a devastating disease like Alzheimer's, those that have financial resources, it is so devastating that often you want to form a new organization, another Alzheimer's group related to that loved one that died, or you've lost that individual. And so there's a tendency to see a proliferation of disease-specific foundations due to the proliferation and increase of wealth of individuals and the devastation of those diseases. When we put on the march in '98, we invited every cancer disease-specific group to join us, and we lined them up on the mall. And so if there were 10 different breast organizations, 3 or 4 to your left, 3 or 4 to your right across the way, you start to think about maybe we'd be more effective like a laser if we could combine our efforts. And one of the challenges often in medical philanthropy is the grateful patients. So you have a clinician who's treated you. They didn't invent the therapy. They didn't do the research that created that form of therapy. They delivered it. And now they're thinking they want to go into research, but there's nothing in their background that would tell you that they are going to be able to form a biotech company. And there are periods of time, I think if you had majored in biology in high school, in 2021, you could have taken a biotech company public. Today, it's much more difficult. And so the outgrowth that we did is we formed a center in Washington called the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. So if there is a cause that you're interested in, and there's others that do this work, and so let's say back in 2007, I had a close friend diagnosed with melanoma. My father had died from melanoma, and they had come to us. So we did a study, and the group that did the work is now the leader, Melissa Stevens, of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, everything going on in the world in melanoma. Let's get a lay of the land. What work's done, what worked, what didn't work, where's the talent, where are the opportunities, and let's assess that before we get started. And I would say to you, very little happened in melanoma between the period when my father was being treated in the mid-70s and 2007. And the formation of the Melanoma Research Alliance, since then, more than a dozen different therapies have occurred. The death rate has fallen by more than 50%, and it's going to fall farther, particularly due to immunology advances. And so they are an extremely effective disease-specific group. Another group we had worked with and I had met with, the Michael J. Fox Parkinson's Foundation. What was going on in Parkinson's? The Multiple Myeloma Foundation. So the goal here is to try to understand what's going on in the field, what has worked, what hasn't worked, who are the leaders in the field, how can you deploy technology? And I think if individuals would do that before they would start investing, we would be far more productive. We have been successful over the past 3 decades in convincing certain disease-specific foundations to merge, combine their efforts so that, as you've pointed out, you can take out the overhead, the management. It's very hard to find great managers. And so the idea that you're going to have thousands and thousands of disease-specific groups and dozens working in the same field, for the most part, they would be better by finding the most talent and consolidating under them. But this is one of the challenges, and I would say particularly in Alzheimer's today, that we haven't had solutions, and the fear in an aging population. But I believe that we're starting to coalesce and see some of the leaders in that field.
All right, so we talk about inefficiency, which leads me to thinking about the healthcare system broadly. The U.S. spends more per citizen on healthcare by a lot than anybody, even all the other rich countries, and yet we don't live longer. And for the most part, we're not healthier, although we are the font of a lot of innovation. But you focused on treatments, you focus on prevention. What do we do about the cost disease? Like, why do you think U.S. healthcare is so much more expensive per patient? Is it overhyped about a problem? And if not, what do we do to get more dollars for patients?
All right. So the first thing we have to address is, are we dealing with the same patients? So when we did this work on obesity, the level of obesity in the United States is quite different, say, than France. And so to compare the health costs in the United States and France is not fair if, for example, the level of obesity is 5 to 6 times higher. We looked at portions. What was a portion in France that people ate? And the portion size what they consider a portion might be 20% of what we consider a portion. So there are many facets, but the first issue is, what are you dealing with? Diabetes is one of the most expensive diseases. High incidence of diabetes in the United States. And if you're concerned you're not going to get diabetes, all you have to do is gain weight and you can increase your probability. But the lifetime cost of a diabetic is maybe 4 times a smoker. So the first issue I want to stress to you here is the demographics, the physical demographics, the weight of a population, just the change in weight in America over 30 years resulted in more than $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion in increased medical costs, just the change in weight. So that's the first issue. And you're seeing that in China today. Number 2 is the demographic breakdown of young versus old. So young costs less in medical costs versus old. So the aging of a population increases your medical costs. Now, in the United States, you would be diagnosed with a life-threatening disease earlier than the general population in Japan. But once you're diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, you want to be in the United States because you have the chance for the most success, everything being equal. So the United States gravitates to more technology. So there are some factors. Next, labor costs in the United States are substantially higher than other countries, so that we have to factor that in. And so you need to normalize these costs. And lastly, the cost of care, hospital care, and others are substantially higher, but that's labor. If you looked at what occurred in 2022, you have some of the world's greatest organizations. Cleveland Clinic lost $800 million or $1 billion. Providence Healthcare System lost more than $1 billion. And that was due to the shortage of labor and the fact that they needed temporary nurses and other medical professionals. It is estimated in the United States today that we have a shortage of maybe 1 million nurses, 400,000 medical professionals, maybe 100,000 doctors. Part of these costs were driven up by COVID and the lack of immigration into the United States. But you are 100% right. We spend more per person and we don't have the longest life expectancy, etc. But there are other problems. Mental health, an enormous challenge in our country today in dealing with that issue, and also the issue of access to quality health care. So during COVID, a lot of positive things happened that hadn't occurred before. One, you had pharmaceutical companies shutting down manufacturing plants to manufacture another company's product. 6-month conversion. Really never happened before. The US government, out of BARDA, under HHS, put up money to build manufacturing facilities before you knew if the product worked. Put up money to make vaccines and antivirals before you knew if the product, but when your estimated cost of the country of $1 trillion a month, spending 20 or 30 billion to have the product available if it works was a change. On the negative side, we discovered, yes, there were food deserts. We were well aware of that, but there were also financial deserts where we couldn't get money to people. And there's also healthcare where you couldn't even access healthcare. And so this drives up the cost, as you know, by having to go to the emergency room and by not treating a disease early. Once it spreads and becomes more, let's call it, throughout your body and more serious, the cost goes up. And so, and lastly, the cost of pharmaceuticals in the United States is higher than other parts of the world. So we are somewhat subsidizing the cost of pharmaceuticals for people in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. But a great deal of this differential in cost has been the lifestyle of Americans.
You mentioned COVID, and the book gets into this, but I'd love you to relate to the folks listening here today. You know, you for several decades had built these and honed these organizations focused on cancer, but also on life-threatening diseases. And all of a sudden, the biggest global pandemic in a century happens. Did you instantly think we're built to deal with this? Did somebody call you and bring you into it? What led you to decide that COVID was our mission, and how did you engage your various entities?
Well, very simply, I was in the middle of a 5-country tour for the Milken Institute. And I noticed at our conference for the Middle East and Africa that all the people from China had canceled in February. Then I noticed that everyone from Italy had canceled. And then my last stop was in Johannesburg in South Africa. And as I started home, I could see this cloud that was now spreading, about to spread. And so we called everyone together at every center and said, we will all be judged by what we do in the next few months. We might not have solutions today, but we need to find solutions. And let's take everything we've ever done and everything we know, and how could we possibly apply it? So each one of the groups rethought what they were doing to see how it would relate to COVID. You know, I personally felt it was important that if I'm speaking to Francis Collins, who at the time was the head of the NIH, or if I'm speaking to Alex Gorski, head of J&J, that everyone be part of that conversation. So I started doing these podcasts, 1 a day, sometimes 2 a day, and making sure anyone in the world who cared could hear what the strategies were, or large employers, what are they doing about their employees. Faster Cures made the decision under Esther Krofa that they would track every antiviral and every vaccine effort in the world and update it daily, over 500. So if you wanted to know what was going on, you could come to this website. Our cancer foundations looked at, okay, a lot of people are dying because of your immune system's reaction to this virus they had never seen, your body had never seen before. But in order for you to energize someone's immune system in cancer, in other words, calling up the Navy, the Army, the Marines, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, you can't have overkill or your own immune system will kill you. So there are cancer products that were in therapies that were successful in not energizing your immune system, but not to the point that it caused you to die. So they looked at every cancer-related treatment to see if there was something there, but at a cost of human lives, and there were a lot of predictions. In the state of California, some of our leaders suggested that 1 in 2 people would get COVID in the next 60 days, that 5 million people had to be hospitalized when we only had hundreds of thousands of beds. But we were used to this, and because if you look back over time, every healthcare crisis, there was a statement made. In polio, the statement made that it might bankrupt the country in the 1950s to build iron lung hotels to keep the polio patients alive. 3 years later, we had a vaccine. In the case of AIDS, Oprah Winfrey went on television and told the American public that 1 in 5 Americans were going to die in the next 3 years. So yes, we lost many people, but that never occurred. And today, with medical advances, a woman who had a 95% chance of passing AIDS on to her children if she had HIV/AIDS, with proper treatment today only has a 2% chance. So that didn't occur. And COVID, what devastation, millions of lives lost. But the projections never occurred because in 9 weeks after we sequenced the virus, we put the first vaccine into a human being. And in less than a year, it was available. So science brings us today, which is why I wrote the book, to the solutions, numerous solutions for life-threatening diseases if we would stay with it. And COVID showed you that we could create a vaccine in a short period of time using technology. Not a decade, not 5 years, but less than 1 year. So we all, you, everyone, every one of us tried to figure out what we could do to help.
So is that, do you think the model, some people talk about curing cancer, but cancer isn't like polio or smallpox, a discrete disease. It's a whole suite of things we keep discovering more. What is a realistic end goal? And this is my next to last question. What do you think when you think of how we will be managing this when you get to Faster Cures 4.0? It won't have gone away. What's a realistic end game?
I think my view of the world changed so dramatically listening to Jim Allison speak in '97. And he basically said, your immune system is smarter than all of us meaning all the scientists, clinicians, and basic researchers in the room, and have been doing a great job all these years, and something went wrong. So if we can solve what went wrong and turn your immune system on to deal with the problem. And so whether it's immunology or others, and there are mutations found in, say, prostate cancer that are in 70 other cancers. So within a decade, I actually believe you're not going to say you have breast cancer. You're going to have, say you have an XYZ mutation that's been maybe expressed in your breast. But that mutation could have been in your lungs, could have been in other places in your body. So I think immunology holds an enormous promise. That's one. 2, early detection. In the 1980s, there was this idea that everything was in your blood. You didn't know what to do with it. You didn't know how to look. You couldn't sequence. Today, now, there's a whole series of new blood tests out that can identify, before you could ever find it, 50 different kinds of cancer. So every cell in your body is leaking DNA into your bloodstream. Now that we can sequence it, find it, we can discover that, boy, you have pancreatic cancer cells in your body. We can't find any pancreatic cancer that has metastasized, but you have these cells, a few of them floating around in your body that maybe we could address today. So early detection will substantially reduce cost, side effects, etc. And that is available today and is expanding. So it isn't just energizing your immune system, it's early identification. And it's a lot easier to treat the disease at the very beginning than later in life. So I am very optimistic. And on the other side of the coin, we can now simulate in computers, doing billions of calculations a second, how this little molecule is going to attach to something else in your body. And so this next 10 years, we might have changes that are so dramatic that encompasses the last 200-300 years of advances due to the power of computers being 1,000,000 times faster and data storage costs 1/billionth. And this should bring down the cost of pharmaceutical products by shortening the period of time, but early detection and driving that cost down. And I think one of the areas that we really learned from COVID was it isn't good enough to have a solution if no one takes it. And I wrote about it that after the polio vaccine was approved, more than a year later, less than 1% of teenagers had ever taken the polio vaccine. And the turning point was Elvis Presley getting the polio vaccine backstage on an Ed Sullivan show. And within 6 months, 80% of all teenagers had received the polio vaccine. So we looked, and I wrote about it back in March and April and May of 20. Who is Elvis Presley today? Is there someone there? And we could not find any one individual that if
Taylor
they said
Swift. It's Taylor Swift.
that was probably our mistake. We didn't test Taylor Swift back then. But it's hard. And so one of the other challenges is that science is moving so fast. Does your doctor, does your clinician who wants to give you the best advice, is he current on what just happened in the last 3 months or the last 2 months? And so one of the challenges is that we've been working on is really educating the clinician on what is the most successful and advanced treatment today.
All right. So my final question, I'm in Washington, D.C. There's a world of public policy. And you obviously have intersected with this world a lot and through things like the work with Senators Reid and Leader Cantor and with doubling the NIH budget in the Clinton administration. Within public policy, if you could snap your fingers and cause a change to happen, what would you change? What would be the highest impact public policy change?
I think our cost analysis is incorrect. There is a treatment for hepatitis C. It was approved more than 8 years ago. It will prevent a large percentage of the people that get liver disease and cure. There's actually a cure. But the cost today is $20,000 to $24,000. And we estimate what the benefits will be, but we've dramatically underestimated the benefits. If you estimate what is the value of a human life, the cost analysis that goes on is what does it cost to treat that individual? And you don't really accrue what that individual's contributions might be to society. So the cost-benefit analysis here. And so you can see in many of these things we're looking at today, there is upfront cost, but the payoff is multiples of what the cost is. And so we delay, in many cases, the most modern advanced treatments that would cure. You don't have to keep getting the disease. In this case of this Hep C, I think it lasts 12 weeks. You take one pill a day for 12 weeks and it's over. That would cure a large percentage of liver. So we are not cost affecting the productivity of an individual. And I told the story in the book of a Trip Cassels, who when I first met him, he had been the heart doctor for both Bush 41 and Bush 43. And he was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer. And he went into clinical trials and lived for about 11 years, 10 years in good health. But you added up all the cost of all the treatments that Dr. Cassels took. Now, what did he accomplish in the 10 to 11 years that he lived? One, he had two tours of duty in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. He became in charge of the health of the troops. He formed two biotech companies and hired hundreds of people. When there was problems at Walter Reed, he took the lead on solving the problems. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health, overseeing the DOD and the health of everyone in the DOD. We don't give any credit for any of the benefits that he gave society. We just total up the cost. And think about his family. When I first met him, his children were young. I think the oldest might have been nine, youngest 3 or 4. They had a father for another 11 years. They got to know their dad, grow up, and they will be different. What they might contribute to society would be quite different than if he had died. And so we are not analyzing, as you would in an investment, what are the benefits of an investment. In the early 90s, we estimated the elimination of cancer as a cause of death, not the elimination of cancer, but as a cause of death. We had leading economists do the work, was worth $50 trillion to the U.S. economy. At that time, it was worth more than 3 or 4 times the U.S. economy. And that was an economic argument we had made. And so I don't think we are cost effective, excuse me, looking at solutions and investments. If we looked at these medical issues as an investment, we're spending 90% of our money on care and less on cure and prevention. So if we could start to switch as a health policy, substantially more money on prevention and research, we'll be able to substantially reduce that part on care.
The book is Faster Cures. Mike, you've been generous with your time. You've been incredibly generous with your money over the years. Thanks for making the time for us and for all that you do.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to visit, and I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Very good. Thanks for joining, everybody.